Oh, well. The thing about a parable is, a parable literally means beside of. Okay, so in order to understand what a parable means, you have to do one of two things. You have to either read between the lines of the parable, or you have to wait for Jesus to explain himself. Now, luckily for us, Jesus typically explains himself right after he tells the parable. And that's what he does today. And another interesting thing about Jesus and the way that he taught, if you read through the passages, you're going to see that whenever Jesus taught, a lot of people showed up. I mean, a huge crowd of people showed up. And in this particular instance, he's out, he's teaching on the beach, and so many people show up that he has to actually get on a boat, take the boat out a little bit onto the lake. He sits on the side of the boat so that way everybody can see him, everybody can understand, and he can see everybody else. He kind of uses it like a stage. So that's how many people were showing up to hear Jesus speak. If that many people show up to hear Jesus speak, that means it must be something kind of important. It must be something that can impact their lives in a powerful way if they're going to show up. So let's see what he was teaching on. Let's turn to Mark chapter 4. If you're using one of the Bibles that we passed out, it's on page 701. Another thing about the Bibles that we passed out, if you don't have a Bible at home that you can understand, I'm just going to ask you to go ahead and just take this Bible home and just read it, just study it, so that way you have something that you can understand at your house. Mark chapter 4, we're going to start off in verse 1. Again, Jesus began to teach by the lake. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it out on the lake, while all the other people were along the shore on the water's edge. He taught them many things by parables, and in his teaching he said, "Listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed, and as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow, but then when the sun came out, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plant, so that they did not bear grain. Still other seeds fell on good soil. It came up, grew, and produced a crop, multiplying 30, some 60, some 100 times." Then Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear." Now, the first thing I want to explain here about this passage here is the first thing that Jesus says. He says, "Listen." This is important. He says, "Listen." There's an exclamation point on this, which tells me in the grammar that I learned in elementary school that this is important. I happen to be married to an English teacher, and she verified that, yes, exclamation points are important. So there's something important about this listening here. Jesus doesn't want people to simply listen. He wants them to pay attention to what it is he's saying. Even more than that, though, he's not calling people just to listen. He's calling people to action, because listening requires action. He wants them to actively listen to what he has to say, and if you actively listen to something, then you're going to have to respond to it in some way. Jesus is getting people to pay attention so that he can tell them a story that's going to change their lives. And the thing is, I think it can change our lives too. Now, in order to fully understand what a sower is, this parable, I think we should know what a sower is. And a sower is basically a farmer, but a sower in Bible times is a whole lot different than a farmer here in Lafayette. You see, a farmer here in Lafayette, they go and they get a John Deere or an International tractor or a Ford or whatever they use, and they go out and they plow the ground into these nice, pretty little rows. And then they get another piece of machinery and they come back and they plant the seeds in these nice, pretty little rows, and that's how they farm. But a farmer in Bible times, they did this thing. They had this bag on their shoulder, and they would reach their hand in this bag and they would just throw it. Kind of this feed the chickens kind of a mentality. That's how they would sow. That's how they would farm. And so when you're farming like that, not everything goes perfectly where you want it to necessarily go. Everything gets scattered that way. And so that's what they did. And sometimes the seed would fall in the path where he was walking, and sometimes the seed would fall in the rocks and in the thorns and then in the good soil. Now, I've heard people talk about this message before. I've taught this passage before, and the way that I've taught it before, the way that I've heard people teach it before is they've taught it based on the sower. They've taken the sower and they've said, this guy didn't really pay attention to what he was doing. And maybe this guy wasn't using his seeds properly and wasn't planting where he should have been planting. But the thing is, as I read it over these last few weeks and as I studied this passage, I think maybe this parable isn't about the sower. Maybe this parable is about the ground. You see, Jesus talks about 4 different types of ground, but he only talks about one sower. There's 4 different types of ground. There's the path, there's the rocky, there's the thorny, and there's the good soil. And so I think we need to see what these are. And now the path is this area that's hard and compacted. And if you've ever had a dog, if you've ever had a dog, you know what this path is. Okay, because this path is that area from your back door to your gate, and then your back door and your gate, and your door and your gate, and that dog just goes back and forth until it completely kills the ground, and nothing will grow there anymore. And you're mad because you've had nice, beautiful ground, you had a really nice grass, and then now you don't, and you can't get that grass to come back because that dog has trampled it down. That's the path. The path is hard. The rocky's a little bit different. The rocky is just a bunch of rocks, and maybe there's a little bit of dirt in there, and maybe there's just a thin layer under the pebbles. But the rocky is shallow. The rocky ground is shallow. The third type of ground that Jesus talks about here is the thorny section. Now, the thorny section is likely a part of the ground where the farmer has come out and he has said, I want to have a larger farmland. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this thorny area, this weedy area, and I'm going to burn it out so that way I can have good ground again. But the thing is, when you burn stuff out, you don't always get the roots. You know, a few years ago, I went and I wanted our landscaping in our front house and our front yard to look really nice. And so I went out to Home Depot and I got some Roundup and I got the black plastic and I got the mulch and I did some edging and I took a couple of days to make the yard look really nice. And it looked really, really nice for a little while. And then all that stuff came back and the grass grew back over the lawn and the weeds came back up into the flower beds. And it was horrible and I was mad. But I didn't keep up with it. So maybe the sower has gone out, he's prepared this ground, he's burned out the weeds, but he didn't keep up with it. You see, the thorny ground is crowded. There's too much going on there. And then finally, we have the good soil. Now, this is where the sower would have spent most of his time. This is where the sower would have spent most of his seed because he knows that this is where he's getting his money back. He knows that this is how to pay the bills. He knows that if he spends most of his seeds here, he's going to have a crop that's going to be able to feed his family for the next year. Because the good soil is good. So Jesus teaches this parable. He talks about the different types of ground that there is, and then he basically says, if you want to understand what I'm talking about, you will understand what I'm talking about. And then he says there's going to be people that don't understand. There's going to be people that don't want to understand. There's going to be people that just don't get it. And so the disciples are there with them, and the disciples are a little bit confused. And they say, Jesus, I don't understand. Can you explain this thing for me? And maybe they didn't understand because they thought that they already had it and they didn't really need to listen to everything he had to say. Or maybe they didn't understand because they were fishermen and they were tax collectors and they didn't understand the whole farming thing. I don't know why they didn't understand, but I'm glad they didn't understand because they asked Jesus and then he explains it to them. And when he explains it to them, he explains it to us also. Turn to verse 14. It says, the farmer sows the word. Some people are like seed sown some people are like the seed along the path where the word is sown. As soon as they hear it, Satan comes and takes it away to the word that was sown in them. Others, like seed sown on rocky places, hear the word and at once receive it with joy. But since they have no root, they only last a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Still others, like seeds sown among thorns, hear the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and the desires for other things makes them unfruitful. chokes out the word. Others, like seeds sown on good soil, hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop, some 30, some 60, some 100 times what was sown. Now, here's something interesting about that passage. Here's something that I thought was interesting, at least. Jesus is talking about the characteristics of the ground. Jesus is spending his time talking about what happens to the ground, what the ground does. He doesn't talk about the ground that wants to be good. He doesn't talk about the ground that says that it's good. He talks about the ground that is good. He talks about the ground that is rocky, that is thorny. Let's look at that. Let's look at what that means. And first of all, to fully understand this, I think that we have to see that the seed is the word. This is the great news that Jeff has been talking about for the last few weeks. This is the seed. So if the seed is the word, then the sower is the preacher or the teacher or the guy sitting at work sharing with his coworker. Now, in this particular instance, I think that the sower specifically is talking about Jesus, because Jesus is the one sharing the word at the moment here. And so if the sower is talking about Jesus, that leads me to believe even more that Jesus is focusing on the ground and not the method. He's focusing on how people hear and what they do with what they hear, and less about who's doing the telling. Jesus explains these different types of ground for us, and it's pretty cool. He says, you see, the first type of ground is the path, and this is the person that has a hard heart. Okay, maybe they've been to church as a child and they got tired of the rules and the regulations of church, and maybe this person has a lot of anger and unforgiveness in their lives, or maybe this person is hurt and can't understand why God would allow these bad things to happen to good people, and so they give up and they don't want to hear, and they allow the word to just set on the surface and be blown away, or let something take it away, so that way it doesn't sink in. Remember how hard that path is that your dog made? This is the heart of the path. This is the heart of the person that's not interested in letting the good news in at all. Do you know somebody like this? Maybe you're like this. You know, we're all here together this morning, and that fact alone makes me think that none of us are like this, but what if I'm wrong? What if you're here this morning and the only reason that you're here is because your mom or your dad or your boyfriend or your girlfriend or whoever brought you here, and it was easier to show up than it was to hear them talk